All right, good day to you. God bless you. Say welcome to the Shepherd's Chapel. Welcome to this family Bible study hour. Guess what? Horses of the Bible. Now, we're going to talk about within this the chariots of God. And perhaps as we move into the lectures, you'll understand why we're going to title it Horses of God. Because horses were used basically for transportation, and chariot, being rakab in the Hebrew tongue, simply means to ride or a rider. It means you're riding. And of course, horses themselves that came into, usually they were a figure of war, like a war horse. And we're looking at both of them, if we may. So let's talk about when Israel first began to acquire horses. It probably happened in Numbers during Solomon's reign. For Solomon would bring horses or buy horses from Egypt, and basically it was kind of a horse trader. Then he would sell them at a profit, those he didn't want, to the Hittites. So he was a horse trader. But he used horses, and of course we know that they were used before Solomon's time, but as I say, at that time in mass. In the horse itself, as you will picture it, is described in Job chapter 39 along about verse 19, where God was dressing Job down. Haven't you seen the horse? You know, he snorts and his hooves gleam as he tears at the ground and charges and rushes onward. God created many things. So the reason I'm going into this, how do you describe, if a man has never seen anything more high-tech than a chariot, let's say you're riding along and the wheels are turning beside you, how do you describe an event that happens in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, which we're going to here in a moment? And poor old Ezekiel had never seen anything fly except a bird. And all of a sudden, we've got something to deal with here. But by going back to the manuscripts and the language, which will convert part of it back into the Hebrew for a clearer understanding, and sticking with the subject of horses of God, first let me say, we call in this generation, the press, the media, and people call we'll use the term flying saucers as UFOs, which is unidentified flying objects. Well, number one, coming out the gate, there is nothing unidentified with God. And are they mentioned in the Word of God? Well, again, that's the situation. Think of a man describing seeing something of this nature. If he's never seen anything more technical, never seen an airplane, again, as I stated, the only thing he's seen fly is a bird. So we got to have some wings for this, all right? With that thought in mind, let's ask a word of wisdom from our Father, and let's just go into the Word and see if we can determine what Ezekiel did see, okay? Ezekiel chapter 1, and let's pick it up, if we may, in verse 4. And verse 4 reads, "And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind." Now make a mental note of this term, whirlwind. We're going to be using it more than one time. A whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself. It was orange, and I mean the glow was present from it, and a brightness was about it. And out of the midst thereof, as the color of ember, out of the midst of the fire. Now, in the Hebrew tongue, when we say color, there really isn't a word. Let's just, if we may, let's call that word color up as it is. You've heard me use ayin, the Hebrew letter ayin, which in ancient symbols here, and it means, as you read there, a primitive word, an eye. literally or figuratively. By analogy, a fountain as the eye of the landscape. Now, when you see this letter on, let's say, a petroglyph or a pictograph, it means, and it being a circle, like our O, it means look. Look and see, and then the message will follow. The very word means not color as we would in English, but it appeared to the eye, ayin, not a leaf now, that's the ox in the Hebrew alphabet, but this is the ayin, which means the eye. We looked to the eye, it appeared, it had an appearance. It had an appearance of what? Let's bring up the word amber in Hebrew, and then a lot of your thought with it will be solved, and it's kashmel. And it's of uncertain derivative, and it's probably bronze or polished spectrum metal. What it is, it's highly polished bronze. And there's a lot of difference in amber than kashmel, a highly polished bronze. I mean, we're talking about metal here, not just a color of a glow of something. I mean, we have an object here. And the material, as Ezekiel would be very familiar with, was highly polished bronze. And so we're not dealing with a vision necessarily. We actually see an object here. And it appears to ayin, to the eye, its appearance is as highly polished bronze. Now he'll give us the shape of it here. You see, going back to the Hebrew gives us a clearer understanding. Now, can we say absolutely that it was highly polished bronze? No, ayin, it appeared to be. I'm sure, and I can guarantee you, it would be a metal so far above anything we have in polished bronze that that it would make man's technology look very small. All right. So what Ezekiel is saying, there was an action, a whirling, with this coming in this cloud of brilliance, and out of the action appeared the highly polished bronze, we'll call it a vehicle. Okay? Now, we continue then, pick it up again with verse 5, and let's move on ahead. Also out of the midst thereof come the likeness of 4 living creatures. There were 4 of these things, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man. In other words, we have, compare Revelation 4:6, where we have the 4 living creatures, Zoe, in the Zun, okay, verse 6. And everyone had 4 faces, and everyone had 4 wings. Now, when God appears, he uses symbology a great deal, and we'll talk, anytime you've got something up here, there's got to be something there that looks like wings, all right? It's airborne. How does a man that has never seen anything besides a chariot describe something? So don't lose touch with the fact that Ezekiel is not really qualified to explain a circular vehicle such as this, but he does a good job. I don't want to take away from him. Verse 7. And their feet were straight feet. That means they were, the Hebrew term is unjointed. And the sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot. You know, there's a calf's foot is straight jointed. It doesn't bend like a man's leg. And they sparkle like the color of burnished brass. And here you have it. What does a landing gear look like on a vehicle? With the, and I'm going to, let's go one more verse and you'll understand where I'm headed here. Verse 8. And they had the hands of a man under their wings on their 4 sides, and they 4 had their faces and their wings. One more, 9. Their wings were jointed one to another. They turned not when they went, and they went every one straight forward. And verse 10 gives you the description. Verse 10, as for the likeness of their faces, they four had the face of a man, Adam, and the face of a lion on the right side. What's always parked on the right in Israel? Judah. What's his symbol? A lion. All right. And they four had the face of an ox on the left side, and they four had the face of an eagle. Numbers chapter 2, verses 10, 3, 18, and 25 will explain these things to you. They are symbols of Israel and the position in which they encamped, all right? So understand the symbology and take from that we can tell by looking at this object that certainly it is symbolic, or its message is to Israel. Verse 11. After you go to Numbers chapter 2, you will understand more in depth, a different subject for a different time. 11, thus were their faces, and their wings were stretched upward. 2 wings of every one were joined one to another, and 2 covered their bodies. What's he seeing? Verse 12. And they went every one straight forward, whither the Spirit was to go. What Spirit? Well, the Spirit was heavy there, all right, well enough. They went, and they turned not when they went. And I'm going to explain that to you in a moment. Verse 13. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, and like the appearance of lamps, and went up and down among the living creatures, and the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. Now, he's having a very difficult time describing a method of propulsion that it's like it had a globe over it. And many people today, when they see a so-called UFO, they see this amber, usually two amber globes, all right? Let's call them energy cells. And I'm talking about people that have had a near experience, as we will say that Ezekiel is having here, not to take away from Ezekiel. So understand, there is energy that is an energy other than burning fossil fuel, as man must do to get someone in orbit. Verse 14, and the living creatures ran and returned as the appearance of a flash of lightning. This was quick, it was flashy. And we all know the stories that go with so-called highly polished vehicles and how they can stop and hover and then psh, they're gone, all right? Like lightning. 15. Now, as I beheld the living creatures, behold, one wheel upon the earth by the living creatures with his 4 faces. Saw a wheel there. How does he know a wheel? Well, there's one on a chariot, all right? One right there on a chariot, he's seen a wheel. I mean, it circles, all right? Verse 16. The appearance of the wheel and their work was like unto the color of a beryl. This is to say yellow, like the highly polished bronze. And they 4 had one likeness, and their appearance and their work was as it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel. Now we have here, how do you describe a wheel that is just up here by itself? And yet there's another part in the center that seems to be whirling, as he's going to tell us here in a moment. And yet he can see people. Isn't that strange? Well, I wonder how he got to that. Let's see if we can tell from the middle wheel to the outer wheel, all being one wheel. 17. When they went up on their 4 sides, and they turned not when they went. Now, that may sound a little confusing, but I want you to picture who we're dealing with. We're dealing with Ezekiel. Now to him, the only wheel he has seen is a wheel that runs by your side when you're riding in a chariot. All right? Now this wheel, on the contrary, is out here in the air all by itself in a circle, and it doesn't look where it goes. All right? It just goes straight forward. In other words, all Ezekiel was equipped with was thought maybe like riding a horse or an ass. All right? When an ass turns or a horse turns, they always turn their neck and look where they're going to go, and a rider, an experienced rider, knows to be very careful. We're about to make a turn here. Or even a man, as far as that's concerned, he turns his head and looks in the direction he's going to go, and then he turns. So how do you describe a circular disc? Has no neck, it has no head. So they just went without turning. They just went wherever they wanted to, straight ahead, all right, because they were circular and they had that mobility. I think he did it. When you analyze what Ezekiel had to work with in this description, I think he did a fantastic job. And one that has rode workhorses, that is to say on the range, cow ponies, better said, and so forth, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And that's what Ezekiel is talking about. And he continues describing this. Listen carefully. As for their wings, they were so high that they were dreadful, and their rings were full of eyes round about them four. In other words, in the circle there were portholes. And the rings means the sound was kind of, it was high enough, there was a high-pitched sound that came from this, but he could see these eyes, which, have you ever seen a window in a pressurized capsule? It's usually circular, most often circular, and he can see windows, all right? Verse 19. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them. And when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. Well, now I want you to know, if you're looking in the window and you're seeing the creatures, or let's say the beings inside the vehicle, if the vehicle went up, they went up. And if the vehicle came down, they came down. Well, if you're in a helicopter, I'll use a helicopter here, probably bad choice, but be that as it may, you can see the pilot in there, and sure enough, you know what? When the helicopter goes up, the pilot's not going to stay on the ground. He's going to go up with it, or he's got bad trouble, all right? So Ezekiel is simply trying to explain what he was seeing, and his terminology you have to take from what he had to work with. Verse 20. Whithersoever the Spirit was to go, they went. Thither was their spirit to go, and the wheels were lifted up over against them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. Now, wherever the wheels went, it went. Well, if an airplane turns, naturally what happens? The passengers don't continue straight ahead. They turn with the airplane. Basically, that's what he's saying. Now, naturally, when he's beginning to work the Spirit into this, you'll find out why in a moment, because God's throne is aboard one of these craft. And naturally, many times I'll get the question, well, why did God need a vehicle? Well, because he had his throne with him. And these creatures also, some of them, guarded that throne. And this is one of those times that he came to earth, and he was able to make this vehicle visible or apparently not visible. And we'll document that before we complete the lecture. Verse 21. When those went, these went. And when those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up over against them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. And it was orderly. It went at the same time, and the people inside of them went at the same time. Okay, 22. And the likeness of the firmament upon the heads of the living creature was as the color of the terrible crystal. This is to say, the color of a sapphire again, okay, stretched forth over their heads above. They could see this. 23. And under the firmament were their wings straight, that's to say level, the one toward the other. Every one had two, which covered on this side, and every one had two, which covered on that side, their bodies. Now, we know that we're talking about something here other than a human, an angelic being, because we are made and we're created in the image of the angels, and we don't have wings, all right? We don't. Verse 24. And when they went, I heard the noise of their wings like the noise of great waters, as the voice of the Almighty, the voice of speech, as the noise of an host. When they stood, they let their wings down. And we could say when they landed, they let their gear down, and they're straight and unjointed. Have you ever seen something like that? Well, we've seen, for example, our men that landed on the moon. You probably have a pretty good description, not really, because it wasn't as circular, and it used a different type fuel than these people used, certainly. But it did have the gear straight-legged down, all right? So Ezekiel had trouble explaining it. Well, again, I think he did a fantastic job. Verse 25. And there was a voice from the firmament, this is to say in the surrounding area of this, that was over their heads when they stood and had let down their wings, their gear. 26. And above the firmament that was over their heads was the likeness of a throne, as the appearance of a sapphire stone, and upon the likeness of the throne was the likeness of the appearance of a man, above upon it. In other words, it looked like a man. Why? Because it was no doubt our Father, all right, on his throne, and he was appearing to Ezekiel. 27. And I saw as the color, ayin, of amber. We've gone into those in the Hebrew. You know what they mean. As the appearance of fire round about within it, from the appearance of his loins even upward, and from the appearance of his loins even downward, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and it had brightness round about. God is a consuming fire. Now, that's not to say that he's not very emotional and so forth, but a description like this is given in Revelation chapter 1 concerning Christ as he appears at the seventh trump. Now, I want to go on, if you don't understand what I'm about to say, because it's only my opinion, number one, I'm not asking you to believe it necessarily, but consider. There are different dimensions. These same vehicles are brought to the dimension in which Ezekiel sees that he can report. But again, I will tell you, there will be some that will appear and then disappear. And if a body be, I'll use the word coated with something whereby the dimension remains the same, but it would be like if you were to have an invisible man and coat him with powder. All right? Well, what if you had an invisible By invisible, I mean in a different dimension, and then he was covered in a likeness. I'm just saying why it might appear bronze even as the craft, all right? It means purity as well, but we're seeing our Father described, okay? Verse 28. Was that next? Let's go with the next verse, 28. As the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness round about. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard a voice of one that spake. And then God speaks to him, the angel of the Lord, and he falls down. This bow, or this prism that giving off all colors of light, it is the real bow, the rainbow, we'll call it, that surrounds God's throne, as it is written of in Revelation chapter 4. In Revelation chapter 6, we have the Greek word toxon for the bow that Antichrist uses, which is cheap imitation fabric in the Greek tongue. So let there be no mystery. God is the same yesterday, he is today, and he will be forever. And perhaps some might think that I digress in certain areas, but I'm trying to help us understand the events that Ezekiel observed. And let there be no doubt, he observed a highly polished bronze vehicle with God's throne aboard it, and God begins to teach Ezekiel. Fantastic message in this second chapter, as well as God's messages all are, all right, about how he was going to send him to teach. But the mode of transportation that he utilized was a highly polished bronze vehicle, and there was more than one of them. The formation that appeared with him. So let there be no doubt. And as I stated, don't you dare call this vehicle unidentified to God, because God knows very well. Now, again, I could say the angels that came down left their place of habitation, as it is written of in the book of Jude, in Genesis chapter 6, back to the beginning, and took the daughters of Adam to wife and impregnated them, and offspring were born. You can read of it in Genesis 6, and your King James brings it out very well. There is a later translation, more recent, that even goes into more detail exactly as I teach it by translating for you. But what my point being, a angelic being that is able to impregnate a woman, and when we partook of angels' food in the wilderness for 40 years, would have to have some type of vehicle to travel in, because there is a mass there. Not flesh as we have flesh, but it was another substance that's we're made exactly in a pattern from it. So I want you to realize there is a side to this that you must open your mind and think upon. Don't make a religion out of it. Just understand the Word. There's nothing in this earth that our Father has not explained to us if we'll take the time to search for it in His Word. So, did Ezekiel see a UFO? Not to God. It was a vehicle he used for transportation of his throne. And it used a propulsion because it could reverse or go wherever it so chose at its own will and its own time. And so it was that Ezekiel was visited. There would be another time that he would be again, but that covers it in Ezekiel. We see Ezekiel describing it in, I think, excellent form and shape. Now, did it happen again? And the answer is yes. It happened in 2 Kings concerning Elijah. Elijah didn't not die. God took Elijah, and we find in 2 Kings, then you'll begin to understand perhaps a little more concerning horses of the Bible. 2 Kings chapter 2, that is to say, and verse 11, and it reads, "And it came to pass, as they still went on and talked," this is Elisha and Elijah. Elijah's about to depart. "That behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven." A whirlwind, a whirling, turning, it would appear. It was circular. And these are horses, so to speak, because they were likened unto war. And again, it bases back to the chariot. That's why it's called chariot. Chariots were most often used in battle, in war, thus described so. And naturally, Elijah was taken up in a vehicle whereby he was able to survive in that vehicle. Verse 12, "And Elisha," that's to say his protege, "saw it. And he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more, and he took hold of his clothes and rent them in two pieces." And of course, Elijah, if you'll remember, had told him, "If you see me leave, then you will find my mantle." And surely the mantle fell away from the vehicle as it departed. So when we begin to see and to understand, then Elijah wasn't the first one this happened to. You'll remember in the book of Genesis, chapter 5, verse 24, and it's backed up in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5, that Enoch also was taken by the Lord. He was taken in this same wise. So there's no, really, when we analyze the word, there's no great mystery in this. And just one more thought before we close this first section. Go with me to chapter 6, and let's pick it up with verse 15. How does God protect us? How do we know what these chariots, are they there? Do we see them? Are they in a different dimension? Of course they are. I had mentioned that. Verse 15, 2 Kings chapter 6. "Elisha and his servant have climbed up on a ridge, and they're looking over, and they saw so many of the enemy that the servant about sold out," okay? Frightened him. Verse 15. "And when the servant of the man of God, Elisha, was risen early and gone forth, behold, an host compassed the city, both with horses and chariots. And his servant said unto him, Alas, my master, how shall we do?" To modernize that, we would say, what in the world are we going to do? I mean, there are enough enemy out there that there's not a prayer. All right? Not a prayer of a chance. Verse 16. "And he answered," this is old Elisha. He had observed these before firsthand when he saw. There was a possibility he wouldn't have seen it. Why? It's a different dimension. You must be aware of that. Don't wrestle with it, and don't let it be a stumbling block to you. But Elisha saw it. "And he answered, Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them." Stop and think about that. I mean, there's just two of them there. Just two human beings. And he's saying there's more with us than there are of them. Verse 17. "And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee." That's what you want to do if you want something, if you need a miracle, let it be in prayer. "Open his eyes that he may see." And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man. In other words, he allowed him and gave him the ability to see a different dimension. And he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. In other words, these circular vehicles, there were so many of them around in that valley that certainly there was no worry. Verse 18, and when they came down to him, Elisha prayed unto the Lord and said, smite this people, I pray thee, with blindness. And he smote them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. So, when God is ready to help you, though you might feel you're all alone, you must have faith to know that he will never leave thee nor forsake thee. And when we have problems, God is certainly able to handle those problems. And he has warriors to do it. It is very difficult when we begin speaking of dimensions or something there that we're not able to see. Do not let it frighten you, especially if it's of us, that is to say, our Father. And if you use your power that God has given you over demonic forces, they will always be for us. If you have that shield up, spiritual shield, I'm speaking spiritually now. But how remarkable when we find that in the Word of God, there it is all the time. And people go around talking about, oh, they saw this circular disc. Well, hey, they've been around since Ezekiel's time. They've been around since Enoch's time. What's new under the sun? Nothing. Now, again, don't make a religion out of this. We're just talking about transportation. Is it a good, bad vehicle, or is it a good or is it a bad vehicle? Well, it's according to who's driving it, just like a car. If you got a nut behind the wheel, it's bad. I mean, he might kill somebody. But if you got a good professional driver behind the wheel, then it's a good car. Right? Going to do good works. So it's just like anything else, nothing new under the sun. So, is that far out? Some might say, well, I trust that you love your Father. That's his MO, his method of operation. It's gone on for a long, long time. And if Ezekiel, who probably gives us the best description of the whirling thing, calling it a whirlwind, that's all he'd ever seen. Did you see that little dust devil go out across the prairie there in Texas, just a whirling? Well, that's what this thing was doing too. So what are we going to call it? A whirlwind. Kind of leaves the appearance. These people had to describe these things. He said there's just a little difference. Ezekiel said it's highly polished bronze. It's a very highly machined metal. It is so machined, it's polished. You see, so read through the eyes of Ezekiel and then update yourself to the 20th century and soon the 21st, and the scales begin to fall away, and you realize, as I forestated, Ezekiel did a fantastic job. Right? Hey, don't miss, we're going to talk about this some more. Don't miss the next lecture. Horses of the Bible, chariots of fire. All right, bless your hearts. You listen a moment, won't you please?